Hi, welcome to the seminar on synergy in M&A. My name is Balasubramanian. I hope to take you in the next 45 minutes through this process, and hopefully we should have a fairly interesting 45 minutes. In terms of structure, what we're going to be doing is going through the slide itself. Give me a moment. Yeah, is going through first what is synergy. Then from there, we'll look at the pharma sector and have an overview of how the sector itself works. Then we look at an individual case study with respect to Allergan and AbbVie, which are two very large pharmaceutical giants that merged fairly recently. Following that, one of the things that we do want to see is how is this synergy actually generated? Maybe some amount of risk analysis of exactly what could go wrong, what could go right as well. And learnings to identify what we've done through this 45 minutes and where the future of pharma M&A looks like. Finally, we would have to have a question and answer session, and I'm happy to take any questions. My suggestion is if you are having any questions, please drop them in the chat window. I'll be more than happy to take them at the end of the session. With that in mind, let's start with what is synergy. And one of the things that is used a lot, and in fact abused a lot, is the word synergy. We use it, especially in management schools, fairly commonly. And to be honest, we have to figure out exactly what it's used for. Synergy is a very specific statement. In finance, at least, synergy is the additional value you get by adding to previously unconnected components. And that's where we need to look at what exactly is the driver of synergy in a business in terms of M&A. Companies have costs, and combining companies can lead to a reduction in costs. So from that perspective, let's look at what we can think of as cost structures that can be cut down. So when you have companies that are merging together, one of the things that you can do is essentially drop employees that are doing the same work. And that's one thing that can be done. You can reassign those employees to more productive work as well. Let's take another example, a slightly more easy one to understand. In the recent merger of Vodafone and Idea, a whole bunch of spectrum assets essentially are duplicated. You can use those spectrum assets much more efficiently by making sure that the merger itself uses those assets as a single stream of spectrum instead of two different spectrum streams. So you get a better quality of service and you have lower costs at the same time. The second way you think about synergy is customers buy products. If you've got a merger of two companies that offer a broader range of products for customers, you can deliver those products at a lower cost totally. And that's another place where you can increase your revenues while still keeping your costs under control. Then one of the other things that we can do is think about it from a perspective of capital raising. Companies which are capital rich, which have access to capital at low costs, can provide capital to companies which are struggling. And we'll look at it with respect to pharma companies specifically. But it's something that, at least in India, is done a lot internally. If you look at, as an example of our large conglomerates like Mahindra Group or the Tata Group, where the holding companies act as resource allocators for capital, where they can move capital from a more efficient company, which generates a lot of capital, to one that needs growth. Finally, companies need to expand. Combining gets us to new markets, and those new markets are places where we can really get more revenue, get more value. An example is a multinational merger. If you want to access new markets, it's one of the easiest ways to get scale fairly quickly. And all of these make 2 + 2 = 5, because where company A and company B together can do much more than what they could do separately. And that's what synergy actually builds. The additional value that you get after the merger compared to the original components that did not make as much sense. That's where you can really, really get some value. Which brings us to the theoretical framework that we can think about. One of the key ways that we can think about mergers, and this is something that McKinsey Consulting, which is a pioneer in strategic consulting and providing value with respect to mergers, has come up with some very interesting thought process. They look at mergers from a perspective of layers, as in you have 3 basic layers, and if you can have a look at the presentation, it's fairly clear. One is to protect the business, where you enter into a merger in order to preserve existing businesses, make yourself a little bit more competitive, and essentially move your competitive advantages slightly further down the line. The second stage is where you also not only protect your business, but grow and become more efficient by capturing what are called combinational synergies, economies of scale. The Vodafone idea example that I gave a few minutes ago is one of those examples where you can drive greater scale at significantly better and lower costs. So that's one of the examples that you can think about when you look at what you get by capturing combinational synergies. Transformational synergies, though, that's an interesting one because that's what most companies always would like to have when they're doing a merger, which is move from one level to an entirely different exponential level of growth. It's very, very important to understand that this is not common. This is not why most M&A is usually done, because it's fairly difficult to achieve. But from a practical perspective, it's something to think about because it's the goal of the ideal merger and acquisition, which is you get a totally different business. And we do have a couple of examples that we can go through. But all these layers of how you get these advantages all depend on levers that you can use in order to drive those layers to get either preserve the business or build economies of scale or radically transform your business itself. Those layers effectively are cost and capital. Both of those are what you call cost centers. So you drive down costs by improving economies of scale. You drive capital costs down by essentially focusing on balance sheets to reduce your working capital and reduce your funding costs. Or you look at it from the revenue line and you try to increase revenues. The more you increase revenues, the more likely you are to get a much, much better outcome out of your merger. From that perspective, one of the things that we can think about is what I call the give and take perspective on mergers. When you're very focused on taking something out of a merger, that's very likely to be the place where you're not always going to be certain to succeed. Let's take an example. When Microsoft went and bought out the Nokia business in order to get into hardware, they were looking to take the existing skills that Nokia had and essentially build a new business on top of it. As you can see, that didn't work out very well because the focus should have been on what can Microsoft add or give to the business in order to get value out of it. So it's something that we need to think about when we're looking at mergers from a conceptual perspective. So let's take a look at some examples. Now, Facebook and Instagram is an old one, but a good one, because Facebook bought Instagram for a very, very, at that point of time, inflated price of $1 billion. This was a company where the revenues were really not visible, but there was a strategy behind it. And what was that strategy? The strategy was that Facebook realized that Instagram had the potential to be a very, very big competitor over time. And by buying it out, they converted it from a competitor to a contributor to the bottom line. So today, if you look at Instagram, it's a very, very large portion of Facebook's revenue. And from that perspective, you're looking at a collaboration of a company that could have been a really big competitor at one point of time. And this was achieved fairly well, very transparently by Facebook. On the other hand, you can think about another option, which is Facebook buying WhatsApp. Now, there as well, you had a competitor sort of situation because Facebook has Facebook Messenger. But that's a little harder to justify because while Instagram costed about $1 billion, WhatsApp is costing about $18 billion. And the way that you're looking at the revenues from WhatsApp is something that is going to be very, very critical to think about. Over time, only time will tell whether we can actually see WhatsApp as successful a acquisition as Instagram was, but my guess is that it's going to be very hard to justify over time unless you get revenues out of it. The second type of merger, which I call economies of scale, is Vodafone idea. There you had cost synergies that were needed, and companies essentially merged in order to fight a stronger competitor, which in this case was Reliance Jio. So they consolidated spectrum, they consolidated people, they essentially tried to drive down their costs so that they can become more efficient. But one of the things that we have to consider is the industry keeps changing. As the pie, the revenue side of the business essentially collapsed, the cost synergies can only drive this much. So that's something that should always be taken into account. When you're looking at a business purely from the cost synergy perspective, are you losing sight of the competitive landscape of exactly where your customers are coming from? And that, I think, is something that Vodafone Idea should have thought about a little stronger. The final one, which we talked about, the transformational merger, is the Apple and Next merger. Now, this is a very, very old merger, so some of you may not remember it very well. But from a perspective of what the situation was in the 90s, Apple was not the company it was today. It was going through a lot of trouble. And as a result, they were a hardware company making computers, and they were not doing a great job of it. Next, on the other hand, was founded by Steve Jobs, who had left Apple and founded the company first to make hardware, which was computers for universities. But over time, Next pivoted into software, where they made operating systems that ran other people's computers, but essentially did a great job of doing it. Now, Apple decided that they wanted those skill sets, and they bought Next for $400 million at the time. Now, one of the most interesting things that they got along with it, though, was Steve Jobs. So Apple transformed itself from just a pure computer maker to a software maker as well. But the big change that happened was in hiring Steve Jobs, they also decided to bet on innovation. And that's how the world works, right? So you can see exactly what's happened. Apple moved from just being a computer maker to an entire portfolio of products across the electronic spectrum. They moved to iPods, they moved to phones, they moved to the personal computing tablet space is driven by that innovation and the culture that came in when Next was acquired. And that's something that you should look at when you're looking at transformational mergers. Are you getting something that's completely and dramatically different from what you're actually doing today? And that's the sort of look that you should be doing when you're checking the landscape for what I call transformational change. It's something that you should absolutely be key and focus on when you're trying to drive a radical transformation of your company. Which brings us to part two. At this point, I'd just like to take a pause to ask if anyone's got any questions. You should feel free to drop it on the chat window. I'm more than happy to respond online. And then we can move forward to the next step. Okay, so that's great. So let's now look at the pharmaceutical industry itself. Now, one of the things that we should be aware of is the landscape of the industry that we want to study from an acquisition perspective. So, apologies, I think we have a question. Yes, please do type it out. That's a good question. So one of the things that I think the answer to the question is also there, which is when you're looking for synergy and don't find it, what do you do? The easy option is exit. To be honest, I think Uber Eats was an example of reaching for synergy. Just because you can deliver people from one place to another does not mean you can deliver food from one place to another as efficiently. The synergy was a little bit tough to justify in that case, and Uber Eats didn't find it. I think it's important to therefore understand that when the synergy doesn't happen, the most optimum thing to do is exit. The second thing you can try to do is force yourself to find synergy, which is essentially invest fresh capital into the business that you've just acquired and try to see if you can develop the skill set as you are doing the integration as well. But personally, I think that's a very, very dangerous tool to do. It's a fairly challenging and capital intensive way to solve the problem and fairly difficult. Yeah, I think we've got another question as well. If that's the case, I'm more than happy if you chat, and I'll answer the question at the end of the session. Since we are having a time constraint, I'd like to move ahead if you don't mind. So the next thing that I wanted to look at is the pharmaceutical industry itself. If you look at the global pharmaceutical industry, and I'm talking about the customer-facing side of it, there are a small number of some very large global firms. These firms are the ones that we all seem to see when we look at the marketplace, which is Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Roche. They're all global majors. And Therefore, we don't always see the second part, which is that research is actually driven by the smaller firms. Some of the things that we should understand is that the large firms are excellent at development and what you call the regulatory process. But most research is not always driven by the large firms. Instead, what you call the molecule research or the fundamental research itself is done offsite at either an outsourced entity or at a research university or some sort of purely research focused institution. Instead, once this research is completed, that's either purchased or the team itself is bought out, and you have development, which is very capital and time intensive because it needs to go through a whole sequence of studies and trials, which are all expensive. And in addition, the process of approvals itself takes a significant amount of time. I think one of the things that you can see is with respect to what's happening in today's world, where the COVID pandemic is effectively forcing drug companies to think through the process of how to develop fresh drugs. They're trying to speed it up, but even with the best of minds working with unlimited amounts of money being thrown at this problem, a vaccine may take 1.5 years, and that's assuming everything goes well. There is no way to speed up a process beyond a point, how much ever money you throw at it. But that's the part that big pharmaceutical companies excel at. They excel at deploying capital and making sure that that process is used fairly efficiently. Once that's done, what do you get? You get a large monopoly opportunity from a successful drug patent. Once you have the patent, it acts as a moat that prevents other people from essentially competing with you, which means you have pricing power, and which comes to my point about the next piece, which is global business with an inelastic customer base. If you look at how companies fund themselves and essentially get customers to pay for their products, healthcare is one which is remarkably inelastic in customer demand. You can increase prices twofold, and if a person is forced to buy that drug, they'll have to buy it because that's the way you look at healthcare, because health is far more important than money to most people. Therefore, it's a relatively well-regulated space as well, because there's a lot of public focus to make sure that you don't abuse that power. But at the same time, since it's a global business, there's a huge opportunity to retain profits once you have a successful product that's out. And which comes to my last point, which is that it's highly regulated, both in production as well as sales. Production simply because the global supply chain helps you, but you also need to be very, very clearly in control, which is where the whole FDA inspections come in. If you have a factory in Pune, you'd still need to be regulated by a regulator in the US because you're making drugs that are getting sold in the US. So that's one of the things that is a focus area for this entire business. And if you look at the global marketplace and who are the players in the pharmaceutical game, it's dominated by some very large Western market players. Essentially, we're looking at Pfizer as number one and GSK-Smithkline as the bottom of that top 10 list. But all of them are very, very large players, from $20 billion to $50 billion in revenues. These are all global giants. But all of these global giants have an important thing to worry about. And from there, I'm just going to the previous slide just to point out a particular piece, which is you've got a large monopoly opportunity from patent moats. But what happens when those patent moats disappear? Then you get comparative pressures from what you call lower cost generics, because making a drug is not as difficult as researching a new drug. And once you identify that a drug has been made and a generic player essentially identifies, hey, I can make this drug at 1/10 the cost, you have an incredibly difficult task in retaining your market share, because that inelastic customer demand that you exploited back when the patent moat was yours suddenly disappears, and you get a whole bunch of low-cost alternatives and comparators coming in. And that's where the large companies are now moving focus. They're moving into innovative and specialty drugs, or where they're looking at chronic diseases, where the potential for revenue comes in over a period of time. And these are areas that are very, very strong focus to all the global giants. So you can see it in the list of drugs that are being sold. You can have a look at it and identify it. But from a perspective of what drives value across the pharma chain, we can think about it in terms of 4 or 5 different areas. The first, of course, is research. And as I mentioned, that research is primarily carried out by the smaller firms. Of course, the large pharma firms also spend a lot of money on research, but that's usually done at the development phase, which is where I'm coming to next. This is where you spend money to essentially build trials, build scale, and build the capacity to produce the drug at volume once you've identified that it has potential. But the identification of potential is at the research stage, which is a much earlier phase. Once development is being done, and this is usually concurrent as well, you go through the approvals phase. And this is where drug development takes the maximum amount of time. Usually we're talking about a 3 to 7 year period. 3 years is most optimistic route you can think about. 7 is approximately a more realistic period, but it can go longer than that. Once you have your approvals in place and your patents ready, then you get your marketing and product itself out. Now, marketing a pharmaceutical product is very, very different from marketing anything else. It's a very, very customer focused product, because at the end of the day, the end customer is a human being who's using it, but it's also a very well regulated product. So you'll need to ensure that you pass through the gatekeepers, which are either pharmacies or doctors or insurance agents, who will essentially approve the use of this product at a particular price. This is a key area where a lot of companies struggle, and where the larger pharmaceutical companies have a significant marketing team that essentially builds on those competencies. The next area, simply because of, again, the time and the cost of development and approvals, is financing. If you have access to a lower cost of funds, it automatically makes you a much more competitive provider of products. And last but not least, and in fact, definitely not least in this case, M&A is a key driver of value in the pharmaceutical industry, simply because in order to make sure that your development pipeline continues, you need to have a research pipeline that's constantly at work. And that means acquiring companies that drive value. These acquisitions are also very, very heavily driven by expertise. So one of the things that you should be aware of is that the expertise needed in order to identify M&A targets is something that's very, very difficult to actually obtain. And it's something that good pharmaceutical companies are excellent at having in-house. From there, we move to an example. Let's start with a drug. And I picked one that you may have heard of. It's called Pantoprazole. It's commonly sold in India under the brand name Pantop. It's used to treat acidity. And almost every drug will start with a disease. The disease in this case is acidity and gastritis. Gastritis is essentially acidity that goes on for a long time. So most people who have had it will know that there's an easy solution. And there's a first solution that used to be there, which is you just take acid plus base, it's a chemical reaction, you get salt and water, and the acid disappears. And that's how antacids work. They've been around since time immemorial, since before modern medicine, in fact. But over time, obviously, modern medicine has developed a good set of antacids. I will take a question on pharma later, immediately after the webinar itself is over. I will definitely take that question. The next step, once you had the antacids, what was developed was what's called H2 blockers. Now, these target the stomach and essentially try to prevent the production of acid at that point in time. This is a big change from treating just the symptoms, excess acid being produced, which is causing pain. You're trying to stop the problem by saying to the stomach, produce less acid right now. This was done in 1964 and it lasted for 10 years. And again, the drugs that were produced were called H2 blockers. The most famous of them is a drug called ranitidine. But even that was not a long-term solution. In 1974, innovation came up with a new drug, which are called proton pump inhibitors. These are essentially drugs that can completely stop production of stomach acids for a significant amount of time. And this leads to the possibility that not only do you solve the symptoms, which is pain from production of acids, but you also stop the problem itself. So over time, if you use a proton pump inhibitor, you actually develop less stomach acids, thereby helping the disease itself getting cured, which is acidity and gastritis. Now that's how drug development takes place. It takes place over time. But what's the business of it? Proton pump inhibitors are fantastically best-selling drugs. They're amongst the top 10 drugs sold even today. But the patents died. After some time, patents will disappear. So Pantop was developed in 1974. The last set of patents that effectively came in expired in 2010. Now, one of the interesting things that you should be aware of is that there's a huge first mover advantage even for generics. And Teva Pharmaceuticals attempted to launch a generic in 2007 with the hope to launch by 2010, which is when the patent was supposed to expire. So they started the preliminary work to make sure that you had a soft launch ready. But they got sued for it and they paid out $2.4 billion in damages because the holder of the patent, which in this case was, if I remember correctly, Pfizer, essentially decided to take action against Teva for infringing on its patent in that period between 2007 and 10. This is a large amount of money, even in a business that makes $50 billion worth of profits. $2.4 billion is not a small amount of money for 3 years worth of trouble. But look at the world today. Pantop is available widely around the world. It's a fantastic drug. It's out of patent, and you can get a strip of maybe more than 10 tablets for less than 100 rupees. So the drug development cycle eventually leads to cheaper drugs over time. The problem is the moat that's built by companies in the intervening period. Which brings us to the third part of our presentation, which is what do you do when you have a moat and that moat is going to die? And that's the case of AbbVie and Allergan. Now, a little bit of background behind this, which is what is AbbVie? It's a very large pharmaceutical major, and it had a blockbuster drug. It has an anti-arthritis drug called Humira, which is the best-selling drug in the world today. It makes more than $20 billion of sales every year, but it's already off patent in a few places in Europe. And you can see it in this quarter's numbers, where its global sales have fallen by 24%, even though US sales are still hugely up for the year because the patents are still up still available in Europe, in the US. But over time, by 2023, you expect Humira to completely disappear from the patent portfolio that AbbVie will have. What does it do next? It needs to have a pipeline of drugs that generate the same amount of value that its blockbuster drug had. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge for a very large company, because however big you are, $20 billion worth of revenue is a lot of money. So one of the things that it did was it scanned the industry to see who is there that can make up for that revenue and is at a reasonable value. And since it's a very large amount of money that's at stake, it could only look at the much larger players than a standard M&A where you look at a research pipeline that's essentially being monetized. So there, Allergan was something that came into mind, because this was a company that had recently, and I'll come to that later as well, recently gone through a takeover piece. They had a new CEO, and he was focused on driving value, but the valuation of the company itself was fairly stunted simply because its existing portfolio was considered to be relatively boring. What does Allergan make? It's well known for Botox, which is also used not only as a beauty supplement, or no, beauty supplement, no, not right, as a age-defying enhancement, rather. And you would also have treatment used for migraines and other pain relief. But Allergan was known as what is called an aesthetic pharmaceutical company. They focused on what I call perception of beauty. So they had a whole bunch of products that focused on the aesthetic part of pharmaceuticals, still very valuable. It's just that they weren't seen as a high growth blockbuster segment, but they generate a huge amount of cash. So here's a company that needs something to replace a large amount of cash disappearing in 2023, and they want stable cash flows after that period. And there's a company, Allergan, that does stable cash flows, has great cash coming in, seems like a match made in heaven. So the two company CEOs had a chat in March 2019 where AbbVie essentially said, we are interested in doing a buyout. This conversation proceeded. By June 2019, they decided to perform the actual merger. Allergan's shareholders were more than happy because it was a 30% premium. So the way the deal itself was structured comes up. And I just want to also, before I come to the deal structure, I just want to make sure that we're clear about exactly what the sequence of events was. Reliant on Humira, which is an anti-arthritis drug. Already, like I mentioned, global generic competition was heating up. Allergan has a very large pipeline of research and development in aesthetics. They also have an excellent stream of cash flows. So essentially, there was a goal to de-risk the portfolio to aesthetics and eye cares, as well as central nervous systems, which is where, again, Allergan had an excellent portfolio. In the meantime, Allergan also faced a lot of focus to sort of move beyond aesthetics and towards a slightly more cash flow generating, more risky set of businesses, a blockbuster drug, for lack of a better way. And that's where the merger then came in. So in June 2019, AbbVie stock was 78.45, and Allergan shareholders effectively get 0.866 AbbVie shares and $120 in cash. The cash component is an important piece because the Allergan shareholders were worried about the cash pile that Allergan was getting, and they weren't getting rewarded for it. So the cash component was to make sure that those shareholders who were invested would get some amount of cash to compensate for their holding the share. Finally, the transaction itself took almost a year to get completed. So discussions were held in March, but the transaction effectively got completed only on May 7th when the AbbVie shares effectively moved up to 84.22. So there was a small amount of a premium that was paid, which, considering these particular times with this particular sort of issues, is actually a fantastic price. The transaction value itself is extremely large, but we should be coming to that over time. So in terms of benefits, what do the companies get out of it is essentially looking at cost synergies. The AbbVie itself is looking at cost synergies of about $2 billion after 3 years, primarily coming from sales and general administration of about $0.8 billion, essentially tying up their marketing teams together so that their cost of sales drops down. R&D costs of $1 billion saved. That's a big amount because effectively the R&D pipeline can be shared across 2 companies instead of 1. And that effectively means, and this is a bad part of it, that less basic research is being done. However, this less basic research is focused on more profitable drugs, which are more likely to make money. And that's something that you should be thinking about. Finally, on the manufacturing and supply chain, they're looking at $200 million worth of savings. These savings don't kick in immediately. They kick in after 3 years. And that's something to understand because a merger has costs. And those costs are important. Those costs come into fees, they come into approvals that need to be incurred, they need to come into debt that you have to take in order to fund this acquisition. As an example, the investment banking fees alone that Morgan Stanley is expected to make from this deal is $120 million. That's a sizable amount of money. And there's a cost of debt of a USD $36 billion bridge loan. That's at a fairly discounted rate of 1.2%. AbbVie's average cost of debt is approximately 2.4%, but that's still something that AbbVie need not have paid for if they hadn't bought Allergan. So all of these costs come in and the benefits don't come in immediately. You can't build a research pipeline on day one. It takes you about 2-3 years building that pipeline and getting those costs down. And in the intervening period, you're incurring costs all the time. And that's where you have to think about the risks in this entire business. So one of the things that AbbVie has committed to, and this is a binding commitment, is that they have to reduce debt by $15 billion and they have to retain their existing rating at an investment grade. Now, what would happen if that doesn't happen? If they don't reduce debt by $15 billion because of whatever reasons, then their rating gets downgraded to junk. This has 2 real big costs. The first is that your cost of servicing existing debt goes up. Currently, AbbVie's cost of servicing debt is about 2%, 2.5%, give or take max. The cost of debt of a typical junk bond portfolio is about 5.5% to 6%. That automatically means that your debt costs rise by at least $1 billion a year, which wipe out most of the synergies that you're calculating for your actual merger. The second thing that happens is that you get covenants getting triggered on the existing loans that you've already got, which accelerate your debt repayment schedule. That is another solvency issue because effectively you may not have the cash in hand to repay those loans which are coming due immediately. And that's a problem because you might end up completely wiping out shareholder value at that point of time. So I want to end with a perspective of what I see as the road ahead, especially in sectors which have what you call high skill and extremely high specialization. You need to have a very, very specific industry analysis that's needed for M&A at a sectoral level. So pharmaceutical sector is extremely specialized. It's important to have expertise when you're looking at M&A deals. It's not just enough to look at the numbers and say, these are the financial matters. It's also important to go down into the operational details. You might need to have a specialist who's an expert at the biology to understand exactly how these drug pipelines are actually looking. And that's not a simple task. That's a very, very challenging role. And even the best firms have trouble doing that. The second is that blockbuster drugs are a double-edged sword. Humira was a great drug all the way until 2023. But in 2023, it's going to become a liability rather than an asset because all the revenues that you're betting on effectively have disappeared in 2023. and you need to still retain shareholder value. So what do? You have to go out and either develop a new drug or buy out another company. Which brings us to the point that pipelines for these drugs have to be built years in advance. And they're all extremely expensive pipelines that you're building, because you're not sure when you're building that pipeline whether the drug is even going to get approved. So that's the risk that you will always face in the pharmaceutical industry. One of the temptations, therefore, is not to go for the big bracket pharmaceutical merger like what we've just seen, but do what's called bolt-on acquisitions. But if you don't have the time for it, which is what AbbVie's got, because even if they do a bolt-on acquisition today, for the next 3 to 5 years, they don't have a fresh drug in the market, which means that in 2023, they're staring at a situation where they might start making enormous losses because their primary breadwinner is gone. So you do one-shot deals in order to sort of get away from that potential problem. But that leads us to what happens if the road not taken, right? An example which is coming in from 2014 is Valeant Pharmaceuticals. It's a Canadian-based company, which was a serial acquirer. From 2010 till 2015, 16, it effectively went on an acquisition spree, buying companies like Bausch & Lomb, a whole bunch of companies. I remember Bausch & Lomb simply because it's something that was a large company that I remember. But it also tried launching a bid for Allergan itself in 2014. Like I said, Allergan has been approached before. This is not the first time it's been an M&A target. This, however, was a very, very different story, because Valeant itself, when it launched the bid, got into a whole bunch of problems. They tied up with a hedge fund manager. There were a bunch of regulatory issues, whether the stock was being bought in coordination. There was insider trading allegations. And that focus and that sort of the eye on them, therefore, led to more problems being discovered. People realized that Valeant had been booking a lot of sales through a affiliate which it had not disclosed, which is called Philidor, a pharmaceutical chain that effectively acted as a sinkhole of Valeant's inventory, which meant that debt started piling up, litigation started piling up, people started suing them, and it took a series of asset sales to bring Valeant back from the brink. They've changed 2 CEOs since then. They've had to sell a whole bunch of their profitable assets in order to bring their debt levels down. And they're finally making a profit today, 8 years later almost. And in that intervening period, they made 2 billionaires completely look foolish. Mind you, those billionaires are very wealthy even today, but that's a lot of money lost. It's over an $8 or $10 billion loss for the investors. And that's not something that most companies are comfortable doing. So it's something to consider when you're looking at M&A. It's not always something that you will get a positive reward on, but when it works, it'll look great. When it doesn't work, it'll look remarkably foolish. And that's something that you should always be worried about when you're looking at M&A deals in any sector, but most specifically in the pharmaceutical sector, simply because of the riskiness of the products involved. So with that in mind, I'm moving on to the final bit, which is questions. I've got a couple of questions already in. The first question, which I can see is, for a product line like pharma, where demand is inelastic, where overpricing is a constant danger, what's the right way to estimate the value that can be harvested by a firm? That's a really interesting question. The example given is insulin pricing in the US. The reason why I think the statement was made about the US is because insulin in India is not as expensive. It's expensive, but not ruinous over here. But in the US, insulin costs are extreme. Part of it is because the healthcare costs in the US are higher than India. But the second reason is that the number of competitors in the insulin space is less. So one of the things that you should be looking at from a perspective of what I would see as ways in which to tackle this problem is to have more competitors in the landscape. As an example, India is a place where insulin is produced by multiple people, from Biocon to Abbott to a whole bunch of different companies produce insulin. Therefore, you've got a whole set of options in terms of who can effectively buy your product. Once that comes in, automatically pricing becomes sensible. In the US, however, it may not always work. So over time, I think they're also trying to increase the number of people who compete, but it's something that will take time. And as you pointed out, overpricing is a constant danger. The only way to target it is by naming and shaming pharmaceutical giants. As of now, that is somewhat working, but it's not an ideal situation. The next question is, what synergy does the acquired company get? How do you justify the synergy for the acquired company, apart from a cash payout to the shareholder, that is? So the first thing I'll say is the cash is an important part. It's an important part of the payout to the shareholders. And that's the primary reason why a shareholder should be willing to sell. If you're not being better off immediately from an acquisition as an acquired company, you should be very seriously questioning whether the deal is good. That's point number one. Point number two is you can also estimate synergies as an acquired company. You can see what risks you will thereby save by being acquired. Maybe your cost of capital is very high, and if you're being bought out by a well-funded company, you effectively get a lower cost of funding. That's one way to think about it. Maybe you have more cross-sell opportunities. You can sell your portfolio of products to different people. Those are ways in which you can justify being acquired. But one important criteria that I always think is important for shareholders of an acquired company is you should be very, very seriously looking at synergy with a very skeptical eye. Your upfront payment needs to be something that's better than what your current share price is. That's as simple as that. The next question is coming in saying, light on industries which are successful in achieving synergy through M&A. That's a tough one. To be honest, I don't. So research has been done on M&A across sectors. And in general, we don't have a sector-specific, this set of sectors always works and this set of sectors doesn't work. That's not how M&A is working as of today. But you can build a set of guidelines. And one of the things which I mentioned, take versus give. If both companies in an M&A deal are looking to take what the other side has, you're likely to fail. On the other hand, if you're interested in adding value, essentially giving back something, and I'll give you an example of a successful M&A to make my point. We looked at Microsoft and Nokia as a bad case, but Google and Android is a fantastic case because Android was bought for $50 million. It was not a large sum of money, but Google used Android to give back, essentially to take the software system and make it better, to put it on phones across the world. That made the entire system better. So an acquisition that is done from a perspective of giving and adding value to the acquired entity is one that's more likely to succeed. But from a sector perspective, it's very hard to identify. The next question is on Daiichi, Sankyo, and Ranbaxy. What lessons are learned in the process? To be honest, the lessons are not good. Ranbaxy was a case of fraud, in my personal opinion. And there's still a whole bunch of litigation going on that. The lesson that I think Daiichi Sankyo learned at least is that you should be extremely cautious in your due diligence in a pharma merger. I think that's a good practice to have in any merger. So it's something that you should think about very seriously. Next, I'm getting a question on two business entities merge. The advantages benefits they enjoy is called synergy. If so, no benefit or no advantages, no synergy. There, I would like to say that it's not always the case. So synergy is something that you can calculate. The advantages should be calculated in advance. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing that deal. So India is the pharmacy of the world, is that right? The answer to that is partly, but a lot of the supply chain in pharmaceuticals is global. So India imports a whole bunch of the precursors to the active product ingredients from China. So it's not always as black and white as it looks. But yes, India is a significant player in this game. What we need to do is get into the research and development side of it as well, in addition to just being the manufacturing and supply chain center of the world. Do patents expire on different dates in different countries? That's absolutely true. They do expire on different dates in different countries. The Humira case is an excellent example of that. So the patents expired earlier in Europe than it did in the US. So you can actually see that for last quarter, Humira's sales are about 948 million in Europe, which is down from its 1.25 billion that it was last quarter when the patent hadn't expired. So that's absolutely correct. Industry 4.0 and R&D of global players, that's a tough one again. To be honest, it's still work in progress. I think a lot of the R&D itself is something that's still being done, and using data and analytics is something that we can think about. I think we also have a question from someone. Yeah. Professor Shrikant, please come in. Do ask.
Yeah, thank you. I think I asked in the chat box, so thanks a lot. Got my answers.
Yeah, thank you. Is not backward integration always good? That's again an excellent question, but one that I will be wary with, simply because in most cases, backward integration is fantastic. Example again is Reliance Industries moving back from the supply chain of essentially being a textile producer to a petrochemicals manufacturer. That's a great example of backward integration working well. But in pharmaceuticals, the risk is higher. If you have a failed product, integrating backwards isn't always smart. And if you incur those costs permanently and they don't work out, and pharmaceutical products, the error rate is really high. You get 95 failed products for every 5 drugs that work. So it's a risk, and you don't always want to integrate backward when the risks are very high. I get a question on what is synergy. Synergy is effectively the additional value you get from merging two companies. So if a company A was making 10 crores of profit and company B makes 5 crores of profit, the combined company won't make 15 crores of profit. It should make 17 or 18 crores, because the additional value that you get from two companies merging together is the additional 3 or 4 crores of profit that you get, because they're more efficient together rather than being alone. M&A deals done closer to home. Tata is still questioning the synergy from Chorus and Land Rovers. Are there any blockbuster deals here which actually resulted in great synergies? That's a good question. There are a few, I think. A good example is one that's happening fairly recently. So HUL just bought out the foods business of, if I remember, GSK. I think that's a brilliant case of synergies. GSK is not in the business of selling Bonvita, right? At the end of the day, they don't want to be in the health foods business. And HUL is a FMCG company. So from that perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense. In even the big cases, you can have M&A that works. But yeah, it's a tough one. I have a question on impact of tax reforms. That's a really challenging one. Tax and M&A are entirely, I would actually keep that as a separate piece. And I would want to talk about it separately. If you can email me, I think it's something that we can carry out an email conversation. It's definitely something that is important for M&A, but one that I don't think is within the scope of this particular webinar. How do companies achieve managerial and operating synergy because of... that's a very good question again. Cross-border mergers are challenging. One of the things that you should be very careful about in cross-border mergers is there is a cultural angle to it. I'm not an expert on culture, so I will restrict myself to the financial part of it, which is that you can't always value the cultural differences monetarily, but you can look at it from a lens of the financial analyst, which is you can attach a value to what you can deliver without the cultural impact. And then you have to let a larger CEO call to essentially see if that cultural integration can be done. My own personal belief is cross-border mergers can work, but you should be thinking about them as transformational mergers where you take in the culture of the other entity and essentially try to build a better business. If you think about it purely from the cost and financial perspective, you may not always get the results you want. So M&A and drivers of value, this is specific to the pharmaceutical sector simply because the drug research pipeline is so difficult to predict that you actually need to buy out companies in the early stages of research and development to have a good chance of profits. And therefore, identifying good quality value buys is a really, really important part of M&A in pharmaceutical sector especially. So that's why I would look at M&A itself being a driver of value for a company that's doing acquisitions intelligently. So any further questions? Fantastic. So I look forward to having your feedback as well. And oh, my apologies. I think I've missed Chorus, Land Rover, and blockbuster deals. I've answered the second part, which is, are there any deals in India which resulted in synergies? But on Chorus and Land Rover was a big success at one point of time. It generated a huge amount of profits for Tata Motors, that is, and they were able to have a very, very unprofitable domestic business for a very long period of time, simply because they were piggybacking off the Land Rover acquisition. But all good things come to an end. And Jaguar Land Rover needed fresh investment. They were not able to get it. That's because the cost that was paid was high. Effectively, Tata and Chorus happened at the peak of the commodity cycle. So pricing a merger is an important part of understanding value. And I hate to say it because I admire Ratan Tata a great deal personally, but I think he got the pricing wrong. Yep. I got another question on government health budget impact of on M&A. It's very, very important because the government is looking at not only having a bigger budget, but a more smart budget. So Ayushman Bharat, as an example, is something where you're focusing on cost of drugs and cost of treatment. In addition to which, this government is showing a striking tendency towards regulating the prices of drugs as well. All of those will have definite impacts on how companies think of profit and losses and cash flows. But these will all be individual sector specific, not just sector specific calls, but individual company level calls, because depending on which company is more efficient, you're likely to get a lot of low cost M&A on the manufacturing side rather than the R&D side right now. Is it applicable in the public sector as well? Absolutely. I believe that the basic rules don't change simply because your ownership is the government or not. There may be a social angle, but I'm ignoring that at this point of time, simply because it's very difficult to value that social angle. A company under distress or under investigation for misdemeanors. There are a couple of examples there. So my favorite example, which I like to give to people, is Tech Mahindra and Satyam. This was a case of distress, definite case of fraud by one of the companies, but you can still find value. If the underlying company generates value, you have an option and an opportunity. The key part is identifying which is the part that makes sense, which is the part that doesn't make sense. For every Tech Mahindra and Satyam case, there is a Daiichi Sankyo and Ranbaxy case. You do not know what you're getting into in case of fraud, which is where all of these cases are really risky. Someone mentioned ILFS, DHFL. Oh my gosh, those are an entirely different set of cases. I will leave that for another day. Thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation, and please do keep in touch by email and share your feedback. I'll be more than happy to receive it. Thank you.